Lesson 6, using diagrams to find the number of groups. We're going to draw some tape diagrams to think about division with fractions. So our I can for today is I can use a tape diagram to represent equal-sized groups and find the number of groups. So make sure you have today's date, your I cans, and your page number. I'm not quite sure why I've started talking like a game show host. It could be just that I needed to. Anyway, once you got all that, you're ready to go on. All right, let's do a little warm up of how many of these in that. So you can think of the expression 10 divided by 2 and 1/2 as the answer to the question, how many groups of 2 and 1/2 are in 10? So what would that do for with our picture here? Well, we'd have 2 whole and 1/2, another 2 whole with 1/2, another 2 whole and 1/2, and another 2 and 1/2, which would give us 4, right? How do I know that this is true? Well, I've made groups of 2 and 1/2, and that's what the dividing by 2 means. It wants us to make groups of 2 and 1/2. And what's that get us when we divide it out of 10? What about here? How many groups of 2 are in 7? We have 1 whole group, 2 whole groups, 3 whole groups. So our answer is 3, but then we have something left over here, right? We have 1 out of 2. So how many groups of 2 are in 7? It would be 3 and 1/2, right? Because we would have the 7 divided by 2. If we multiply 3 and 1/2 times 2, do we get 7? Well, 3 times 2 is 6. 1/2 times 2 is 1 whole. That makes 7. Same thing with up here. We can do the same sort of thing. 2 times 4 gives you 8. 1/2 times 4 gets you 2. Put those together, you get 10. All right, so let's do the same sort of thing thinking about fractions with tape diagrams. So to make sense of this, to make sense of this question, how many 2/3 are in 1? Andre wrote equations and drew a tape diagram. Did something times 2/3 gave you 1, or 1 divided by 2/3? So how did they work that out? Well, this is like the pattern block one we did on a previous lesson. We take 1, we break it into thirds. 2 of those groups of thirds make 1 group, right? So 1 complete group. We have 1 part of a group here left over. Is that 1/3? Well, the space that it represents is 1/3, but how many groups of 2/3 is that? Well, it's only 1 part of 2/3. In fact, it's 1/2 because 1/3 and 1/3 makes 2/3. So the answer is 1 and 1/2. And this is just kind of a visual representation of what was going on with this. The tape diagram can kind of help us see that visually because we have 1 total group of 2/3, because here this is not saying that the answer needs to be in thirds. What this is saying is groups of 2/3 we can take out of 1 whole. We can take 1 full group of 2/3 out, right? We've got a part of a group here, and this is worth 1/3 on its own. But the question is groups of 2/3. Well, if this is 1/3, I'm missing another third. So this is only half of what I need, and that's why it's 1 and 1/2 in this situation. Let's take a look at a few more. So if I've got 3/4 are in 1, what's the division sentence we're thinking of with this one? Well, this is going to be 1 divided by 3/4, right? What about the multiplication? yeah, this is going to be 1 is equal to 3/4 times something. We don't know. In both cases, we don't know the answer. So how's that look here? Well, I'm going to use 4 of those spaces there. That gets me, that's 1 whole, right? The question is how many 3/4 are in there? Well, each one of those is worth a 1/4. So from here to here is 1 group of 3/4, right? So I have 1 whole group of 3/4, and then I've got a 1/4 left over. But how much of that, how much is that 1/4 out of 3/4? Because we have 1/4 out of the 3/4, right? So I've got 1 out of my 3 that I need. So if I have 1 out of 3, my answer is 1 1/3. Does that work to come back to 1? Well, 3/4 times 1 is 3/4, right? 1/3 times 3/4 gets us 3/12, right? If we add those together, that 3/12 is the same as 1/4. 3/4 and 1/4 together makes our 1. Okay. What about here? How many 2/3 are in 3? What do those equations look like? Well, for the division, we've got 3 divided by 2/3. For the multiplication, we have 3 is equal to, 2/3 times, and in both cases, we don't know what the answer is right now, do we? Well, we're going to use chunks of thirds here. So there's 1 chunk of 3. Hang on a second, let me fix that. I'm going to make it just a little bit bigger. So there's 1 chunk of 3/3, 2, 3. Okay, so I could break these off as 3 whole. Each one is broken up into thirds. So the question is, how many 2/3 can we make? Well, there's 1 2/3, so there's 1. I can cross this out here. That makes 2 groups of 2/3. There's another one, 3. There's another one, 4. And here I only have 1/3. Well, I need 2/3 to count as a group, but I only have 1 out of the 2. So my answer is 4 1/2. And I know some of you are asking, but Mr. Palin, that's a third. I know it's a third of the 3 here, but that's not the question. The question is, how many groups of 2/3 are there? We had 1 group of 2/3. We have two groups of 2/3, 3 groups of 2/3, 4 groups of 2/3. This is a third, but we need 2/3 to make a group. Well, I've only got 1/2 of it because I would need 2/3 to make the total. I've got just 1/3, so that's why it's 1/2, because it's only 1/2 of the total. What about 3/2 in 5. Yeah, we're going to do 5 divided by 3 halves, or 5 is equal to 3 halves times something. Okay. Okay, let me see. I'm gonna use halves here. Okay. So I went ahead and used 2 squares together to show one whole. So here's my 5, right? And it says 3 of the 1/2 do we get out of 5? So there's 1, 2, and 3 halves. That's one group. 1, 2, 3, that's 2 groups. 1, 2, 3, that's 3 groups. So our answer has to be 3. And then I've got one more half here. So is it 3 and 1/2? No, because we need 3 halves. Well, I've only got one of the 3 parts I need. So my answer is 3 and 1/3. I think the tape diagrams can help you with this, so don't give up on the tape diagrams quite yet. Okay, we're going to do one more part here, finding numbers of groups. So for each of these, draw out a diagram, but you can think of the multiplication or division sentence for each situation. So like on this first one here, we've got 3-inch thick books make a stack that is 6 inches tall. So how many 3/8 inch books is it going to take to make 6 inches? Well, that's 6 divided by 3/8, right? So what's that going to end up being? Well, you got 6 broken up into groups of 3/8. How many 3/8 is that going to take? Well, how many 3/8 can you get out of just one whole? You can get 2 whole groups, or 2 complete groups of 3/8, right? And you can get part of another one. So for each one of these, we've got at least 2, right? Okay. So if we take that 6 and we break it up into 3/8 groups, how many 3/8 groups will you make? Or 6 is equal to 3/8 times what number? Well, think about it. You're going to have some number up here that when you divide it by 8, it makes 6, right? It's 48. 3 times what makes 48? 16. 16 books. How many groups of 1/2 pound are in 2 3/4? So we got 2 3/4 divided by 1/2. Well, 2 would have 4 halves out of it, right? Because one whole would be 2 halves together, so you got 4. You can take one more half out of 3/4, so that gives you a total of 5, which gives you 1/4 left over. How much of a group of 1/2 is that? 1/4 is 1/2, so it should be 5 and 1/2. And actually, if you think about it, I cut all this in half and I ended up with something that was twice as big, didn't I? Okay. So the big things to think about here, and like a question of how many 3/4 are in 6, or 6 divided by 3/4, what does each of those mean? Well, the 6, remember, means the total, and the 3/4 is how much under each group. Tape diagram is going to show groups of 3/4 together and show you how much you have left over after you get done. And that tape diagram is just a concrete way for you to draw it out so you can see it more carefully. What do we do with those remainders at the end? Remember how we talked about the remainders before was that if we had a remainder, that was how many parts out of the total number of parts. So if we have 1/4 left over, how much of that, how would that be represented as a group of 3/4? Well, 1/4 is 1/3 of 3/4. So you'd have whatever your whole number was with that one. Oops, hang on. Sorry about that. So that remainder ends up being a fraction of whatever parts that you're talking about there. So we used pattern blocks, we've used fraction strips, we've talked about other diagrams, tape diagrams, to help us with this. So how are tape diagrams like those other tools? Again, they're just different ways to help you visualize how you're splitting things up, and they're just a different way for you to help figure it out. Okay. If you're talking about 6 divided by 3/4 or 18 divided by 2/5, how are those tape diagrams going to look different? Well, obviously for the 6 divided by 3/4, you're going to talk about one that's not quite as long, and it's going to have groups of 3/4 broken up out of it. Whereas this one, 18 divided by 2/5, it's going to be bigger, yeah, because you're breaking up a bigger thing, but each of the parts are going to be different because 2/5 is a smaller fraction than 3/4. So it's going to actually create even more groups than the 3/4 would. All right, so a little long, but I think you're good to go now. Make sure you're asking questions if you're still having trouble with it. And don't worry, we'll get there. It's a process.